Well, welcome. It's so thrilling to be here and honored to be a host for session A of session one. And a big thank you to Caitlin Stout, one of the two co-organizers of the 2020 English Conference. And this, of course, is climate writing. And I see many familiar faces and new faces, some of the other readers. And some very, very talented writers as well. So I think my name's Ted Anton. I'm a teacher of creative nonfiction, science writing, and magazine writing. And I'm familiar with many of the pieces and really looking forward to hearing some of the new pieces today. I love what you write. I find it super important right now, and really you'll find out what high quality the work that's being done in DePaul English department. So the format will be introduce each speaker, they will read or speak, then we'll go through in order, starting with Maxwell Rowe-Sutton, followed by Karen Rosen, and then Abbie Colchis. And then we'll open it up to questions and, let it go from there. So be writing, be listening, writing your questions as we go. At the end, we run out of questions. Might go around and introduce ourselves and what we do. That'd be kind of interesting as well. Okay, so Maxwell Rowe-Sutton, senior, studying English with a focus in creative writing and philosophy. He enjoys writing stories and novels set in the near future. These works address political, economic, and environmental themes. His senior thesis project sounds fascinating. It's called Cloudbreak: Stories from a Changing Climate, in which you are looking at the climate crisis as it's portrayed in fictional narratives. Thank you, Matt. Welcome.
Cool, thank you. So I was gonna take a hybrid approach and just read like a really short introduction of Sit Still, the story, and then kind of transition into the short presentation I prepared. So feel free to cut me off if this extends past 5 minutes. So just let me know. All right, so I'm just gonna read the opening of Sit Still. The cows used to sit before the rain. I remember my mom driving past fields of immovable brown and white spotted boulders. Their tails swung at slow cadences and their chewing was calm and rhythmic, like washing machines set on low. These days, the cows were dancing in the storms. Their movements weren't celebratory. The animals didn't honor a young calf's arrival, lights and streamers disrupting their farmsteads. No, they danced from fear. The rains meant winds, meant floods, meant even a boulder's mass was pebbles and rushing water. They shook their butts and swung their hips during unsteady gallops, the ground's wet under hoof. Was dancing fun if the dancers frantically sought higher ground? I realize now that being a boulder, immobile, is an underappreciated luxury. The cows who sat expected not disturbance. To recline was to restore, and one could only restore among stable habitats. Although the world is dynamic and environments trend toward discomfort, the timescales are slow enough to allow for adaptation. I think of those creatures who, over millennia, found comfort in scalding deep-sea vents. Perhaps these spaces, once thought unfit for life, are the closest analog to our future. Tube worms, their bright filaments spotting the dark, enjoyed millennia to flourish beyond sunlight. As record heats and June winters startled our communities, we lacked the buffer of measured adaptation, a slow-moving leisure indicative only of geologic time. Our best response was quick movement. Empty refrigerators and pre-packed suitcases, families scattering like crows from a shaken tree. So that was the introduction of Sit Still. And now I'm gonna just transition into the short little presentation that I wrote. So like Ted said, my name is Maxwell Rowe-Sutton. I'm a senior and I study English with a focus in creative writing and philosophy. My goal is to write stories about the climate crisis, to address ecological destruction through the lens of fictional narrative. For this conference, that aim manifested in a story of environmental change named Sit Still. For the last few years, the climate crisis has lingered as an anxiety in the back of my mind. It rarely enters the foreground except in isolated bursts, and that's because it's too exhausting to consider the scale and existential nature of the climate crisis for too long. I wanted to make the climate crisis feel personal, to express environmental degradation in a way that I found interesting. A lot of environmental writing deals with place. Leslie Silko's Laguna novel, Ceremony, asks what it means to feel rooted somewhere. Is our home environment a mere stage upon which we live, or does it integrate with our stories, myths, communities, and politics? Sometimes it's difficult to appreciate the place you were born, the unique flora and fauna, the flowers, the shape of the lands, until you've left. The climate crisis is unique in that it destroys the environments we once knew. Solastalgia is a new term that describes a bizarre feeling. Nostalgia for place, a dread and sadness over an environment that's been lost. We might imagine a charred forest or a village on the coast that no longer exists. Maybe it's something more subtle. Your hometown is warm and humid now, and whenever you walk outside, you're attacked by a cloud of gnats. The heat makes you exhausted. Sit Still tries to capture some of these feelings. The story begins with the line, "The cows used to sit before the rain." I grew up in Southern Illinois, and this was a common sight. But in the world of Sit Still, the cows are wiry and muscular, and when it rains, they gallop, because rains bring floods. The main character, who lives with his mom and moves often, likes to hide within tall grasses and watch a family that lives in a pink-white mansion. Multiple generations live beneath this single roof, and the main character is intrigued. By the story's end, a wildfire destroys the mansion and erases the family. In this regard, Sit Still asks whether the stable habitats that define past generations are gone. Our surroundings have always shifted, but never at this pace. Can we lay down our roots and build multi-generational families, or will we have to adapt to ever-changing weather conditions and never really inhabit a place? Sit Still was my initial attempt at climate writing. Over the past year, my desire to write environmental stories has calcified into my senior thesis project called Cloud Break: Stories from a Changing Climate. This project contains 2 short stories, both 25 to 30 pages in length, and asserts that art, whether fiction, photography, or any medium that tells a story, is essential to the climate crisis. I felt that there was a deficit in popular literature. Somehow, humanity's existential crisis had been ignored. While science fiction has long dealt with broad economic and environmental issues, these subjects rarely enter the cultural discourse of literature. Granted, there are many exceptions to this standard. Both in our contemporary moment and throughout American history, there's been a vanguard of beautiful and experimental environmental literature. Yet, when I consider that the climate crisis threatens the entire existence of modern society, this collection feels insufficient to meet the challenge. There are dangers of writing about climate change. Stories can't become billboards for climate activism. That style of brash writing is best suited for nonfiction essays and op-eds. A good climate story is, at heart, a good story. It provides nuanced characters, a well-rendered world, and allows readers to draw their own conclusions. The key is that climate pervades the background of our narratives. As in our own lives, it rarely consumes us and it never vanishes. Here's to hoping we have something to stay nostalgic about.
Thank you,
That's
Matt.
all.
That's perfect. Yay! Air clap. That's next up is wonderful writer Karen Rosen, who began DePaul's Master of Arts in Writing and Publishing program in the 2019-20 school year, while working as a development officer on foundation and government relations at the Chicago Botanic Garden. It's therefore no surprise that her first public reading at DePaul is about nature and a plant species she's particularly fond of. Karen just received the Bill and Irene Beck Award for Community Engagement for her grant writing for programs that bring access to nature and nature-based learning and food, health, and jobs through urban agriculture. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you. I'm going to do a straight reading. This is a piece I wrote in Dr. Anton's class. It's called "We Traveled Across the Ocean." My grandparents, with 2 babies in tow, bobbed across the sea for days on end after they left the only home they knew, Czechoslovakia, as Hitler's troops were about to invade Prague. Some days and nights, the shuddering wind blew the ship into waves so grand that they violently rocked the family to sleep. Resilience, a trait of a family that lived, made it across the ocean and put down roots despite all they had left behind. Resilience is also the hallmark of mangroves, some species known as walking trees, as they have the ability to drop roots as they grow and protect their offspring at all costs. After my grandparents arrived in South Jersey, they went about the business of rooting themselves. My grandmother, an esteemed local judge in Teplis, their historic, sophisticated hometown, watched men harvest fields of potatoes next door to their rented house while there was nothing to feed the children. My grandfather, an electrical engineer, caught buses to find any work he could. In a torrent of news after World War II ended, they learned who was lost, a tangle of mothers, fathers, a brother, friends, teachers, neighbors. A tangle as complicated as a mangrove swamp, difficult to tell where roots leave off and branches begin. Sometimes a mangrove propagule can travel in open water, come to rest and root on a distant shore, and even grow an entire island. In the same way, my family settled in. They learned English, found other Holocaust survivors who had become lifelong friends, and scraped by with enough money to eat and buy a home. The family's connection with nature is what buffered them. My grandparents and the children religiously hiked in the state park near their home, sandy red soil and brown lakes. They often visited the nearby Jersey shore, the edge of the country, to meet the waves on which they had arrived. One winter, after my mother and her brother left the house for college and then began families, my grandparents packed the car and discovered Sanibel Island on Florida's Gulf Coast. At that time, the island was a wild jungle anchored by the mangroves that formed and protected it. In South Florida, 3 kinds of mangroves support a web of life that is as essential as love is, even in the most complicated, traumatized families. Mangroves are known as a keystone species because they do such a good job of fostering and sheltering ecosystems, buffering land from storms and heavy wind, and preventing erosion. For these and many more reasons, mangroves are now protected by the state of Florida. Much of the state's mangroves were destroyed to make room for development. As a child who grew up diving into crashing waves on the New Jersey shore, I am most fascinated by the red mangroves because they live at the interstices of saltwater, land, and wind. They have chaotic intertwined roots called prop roots and appear to be standing or walking in the water. In fact, they grow by dropping their reddish roots, which eventually take hold. Whether they are salt-loving or just have the capacity to make do, mangroves are halophytic, meaning they can take in salt water and transform it to fresh water for their survival. Some mangroves filter the salt at the roots, while others exude salt from the leaves like tears. The red mangrove seed, a propagule that looks a bit like an inflated slug, grows roots while still attached to the parent. It can then drop to create a knobby rootlet in the silt after it falls off the family tree. While there is a possibility that propagules can travel far from home and take root, even to foreign countries, most tend to stay close to the family, as gnarled as it may be. I was 6 years old when our family visited the grandparents on Sanibel for the first time. Then I could not have predicted visiting the island year after year across my adolescence and adulthood. I could not imagine being older than my grandparents were then, as my siblings and I are now. My daughter's first vacations were to Sanibel Island. After Hurricane Charlie roared across the evacuated island in August of 2014, my daughter was 3 years old. Sanibel's vegetation was shredded and bare. The roots lost legs, the green waxy leaves were scattered and blown. The tangle of roots and fallen branches appeared as the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, ancient graves falling over themselves. Unbelievably, the first year after the storm, the shrubs began to grow again and produce leaves, not seeds. They just didn't have the energy to do both. With the open canopies, the babies that waited patiently underfoot as little knobs grabbed the light and grew. And I see I'm at 5 minutes, so I am just going to read, if it's okay to take a little bit of time, I'll just read the last paragraph. My older brother and I placed my 5-year-old daughter between us in a kayak and paddle through the low branches of a mangrove swamp. Spiderwebs glisten from branch to branch. White ibises feed at the water's edge, and little blue herons perch in the green foliage. Hundreds of small crabs that appear at first as branches begin to move, show themselves as we float past. Nurseries of baby fish swim within the mangrove roots, cribs of sorts protected from predators and waves. History repeats itself, one paddle at a time, and now my daughter is old enough to steer around fallen branches herself. I know now how the history of mangroves and family are intertwined.
Thank you. Air clap, beautiful. Wow.
Thank you.
And I'm thrilled to introduce our third and final speaker, Abbie Colchis, who has just completed her first year in the Master's in Writing and Publishing program. She works as a graduate assistant in the DePaul University Center for Writing-Based Learning and would like to continue working with writing on completion of her program. Thanks, Abbie.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I do have a brief presentation. If I can share my screen, is that all right? Can I get that enabled? I'm disabled from sharing it. Is it working for you? Not yet. I think I have to be a co-host or something. I can also just speak if that works too. Try it.
It's too bad Michelle just left because she knows how to do this. You make her, Abbie, Caitlin, you make her.
Here we go. I got it.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you, everyone. I just like having a visual for myself to go off of. So I'd like to just share a really brief presentation with you about a poem that I wrote this quarter called Evening Pond in April. So this was an emulation of a Robert Browning poem. I'd been doing a little bit more reading and researching of some of the older forms of poetry and older Victorian era and Romantic era styles, because that's something that I haven't looked at in quite a while, and I wanted to push my writing and maybe try some new things into new forms. And so specifically I came across the poem Porphyria's Lover by Robert Browning, and I've got just a really brief excerpt of it there. It's a lengthy poem, but I thought it was really interesting. It's one of his dramatic monologues, and for anyone who's familiar with it, it's rather a grim poem. It's from the point of view of a murderer and possible psychopath. So not quite the subject matter that I emulated, but it's got an interesting rhyme scheme and meter that caught my eye. So it's an A-B rhyme scheme, which is often interpreted by scholars as an indication of madness, which fits with the speaker of the poem. And then it's an iambic tetrameter, so that's 8 syllables per line and 4 stressed syllables per line. So I thought that was really interesting. I'm more familiar with iambic pentameter, and perhaps you are as well. That's more like Shakespeare and sonnets and things like that. But I liked this kind of abbreviated meter and the musicality of it. And as most meters do, it tries to mimic natural speech. And so, continuing on. So I took Professor Richard Jones's poetry class this quarter, and we were working with landscape poems. So describing landscapes similarly as you would to like an artistic landscape. And I'd had this desire for a while. I'd had an idea to combine some of those pastoral back to nature themes that were really common in the Romantic era with the current landscape of the pandemic and everything that's going on right now. I also feel that, at least for me, I've been paying much more attention to the outdoors and much more getting out into nature as we're trying to get that fresh air in those walks. So I thought that might be an interesting dynamic to combine those two ideas. And then of course, there's also a lot of feelings of maybe madness or instability right now with just these bizarre couple of months and even the past week. And so I thought that fit well with the madness that's interpreted in Robert Browning's poem, too. So then putting it all together, my title is Evening Pond in April, and that's also trying to emulate a little bit of those, an artistic portrait and the way that those are often titled. I wanted to include nature as a retreat, although not far from development and society, and certainly not unaffected by what we do in our response to it, as we have seen in this panel. And then I also wanted to include the pandemic as a subtle backdrop, not necessarily the primary focus, but something that's happening in the background of this natural scene in this poem. So I will read my poem to you, Evening Pond in April. It was on one late afternoon, and as the day closed into night, that I at last escaped my room and strode beneath the evening sky with golds and pinks of trailing light to show to me the streets as guide. I turned away from quiet houses with supper table warmth inside, into the woods where shadow douses starlight through the oaks and rouses the hidden wildlife yet asleep. And looking there, I found a pond, and in the pond a fallen tree with mossy spine and body long and ancient arms to rest upon. There I sipped the forest silence as empty as the streets had been. Isolation, sickness, violence, everything I held within, I breathed with silence out again. Then, though slowly throughout the dell, perceiving that I was not there, spring peepers with orchestral swell upraised a chorus to the air, and singing filled the night like prayer. And I remained with frozen limb and music cutting to the bone, that I should not disturb the hymn and hush them in their mossy home and have to leave the woods alone. Right, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Abbie. The marvelous poem. Oh, wow. So I have lots of thoughts and questions, but I'll just open it up maybe to our audience and anything that you reacted to or wondered about. And if not, I've got some questions. Megan.
Abbie, thank you so much. Your poem was really fun. I really enjoy you can hear me, right? Okay.
Yes.
That's always I really enjoyed hearing you think about the difference between musical and natural speech, and I just wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that and how it kind of steered your poetry, particularly in this nature influenced work.
Yeah, for sure. So I touched a little bit on the different poetry meters that can be used. And this may just be my personal opinion, but since iambic pentameter tends to be longer, I feel that it has not necessarily so much of a sing-songy sort of rhythmic tone. And that, of course, is mimicking natural speech, maybe more in the sense of like complete sentences or full thoughts. Whereas this shorter pentameter, or not pentameter, but tetrameter, to me seemed a little bit more like a song, shorter phrases and not necessarily these longer sentence-like ideas. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, so that was one thing that I noticed.
I had a question for Karen. You also did a very lengthy interview with a mangrove researcher, which doesn't work itself into your beautiful essay, but does it? Did you get some insights from the nonfiction reporting that, or not for that matter, helped you in shaping this that remarkable narrative?
I did, actually. So I was able to, very kind, he spent an hour with me, and I asked him, first, actually, I was gonna write a nonfiction, like not so much a lyrical essay, but a nonfiction piece about the mangroves. And he provided me with all kinds of information that then I integrated into the text. Some of it's not there because it was only excerpts. And the other thing I did was I took a tour through the mangrove swamps, like a kayak tour with a leader, and I kept asking questions about the mangroves. It was like a bird tour and everything, but I kept asking him about mangroves, this and that, and things like that. So yeah, both of those definitely made their way into the piece, and just my understanding of mangroves, which I grew up with them, but I didn't truly understand a lot about them. So that really helped me do the parallels between family by having that knowledge, if that makes sense, from interviews and the kayak tour and books. I got books out from the library about mangroves and read about them too. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? All right, Max. So this what's fascinating is that you're doing a thesis, which sounds like pretty straightforward, interesting eco-criticism, literary analysis. But then your open was so poetic. I didn't know that cows do that sit before rain. And so is your thesis both combined, like essay and analysis, criticism, and also what are some of the other works that you look at in your thesis?
So yeah, that's an interesting question. The thesis, I think, tried to put into practice some of those ideas about climate writing. So it's actually entirely fictional. So it's comprised of like 2 short stories around 20, 25 pages in length. And they just kind of try to couch some of the ideas about what does it mean to write about climate change? How do we tell stories? How do we keep our stories nuanced, but still kind of express the almost the existential doom of the climate crisis? So it actually only takes the fictional creative form. In my reflection, I kind of addressed some of those more nonfiction or theoretical elements. I was actually inspired by, there's this guy named Amitav Ghosh. I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He wrote this book called The Great Derangement, in which he kind of said that literature was deranged for not really taking the crisis and like by the reins, I guess. So that was like one of the initial inspirations. The rest are kind of like works of environmental thought and philosophy. Like I read Naomi Klein for this. And some of them are fictional. Like I mentioned the novel Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. And another example, hers aren't always explicitly environmental, but I was also inspired by Ursula K. Le Guin. In her kind of science fictional writings, I think she expresses some of these ideals of how do you express political, economic, and environmental issues in like a good story. So those were some of the inspirations.
Fascinating. And by the way, speakers, you can ask questions of each other, but okay.
I can follow up on that real quick. I'm just, Ghosh source is really fascinating. And I wonder what or how, because he makes an argument that literature can do things that nonfiction writing can't. So I wonder what you felt that you could do in poetic or fictive writing that you would not have been able to do in like a term paper kind of a thing.
Yeah. That's a great question. I've always felt that reading or writing literature is like an exercise in empathy. So the experience of reading a story that involves like fictional characters is like the experience of feeling into their lives. And in that regard, I do think it offers like really special opportunities that you might not get in like a direct paper or essay on the topic. And I guess the other thing that I'd say is that for some reason, like my mind just holds stories for years and years. And I think you could expand and say that like our society is in some regard a bundle of stories, like a collection of stories. What are our cultural narratives? What are the stories that are told by, you know, big institutions like Hollywood, or what are the stories that are told in literature? And I think stories have like an incredible play upon our emotional faculties. So in that regard, like the idea of narrative as kind of a method to address the climate crisis is unique in that it's emotional, it's empathetic, and we just seem to have minds that love to hold stories.
Max, do you interview scientists to get like the scientific perspective of climate change, or are you really focused on the fiction part of it?
I think in my personal life, I'm really intrigued by the scientific aspect, but maybe if there's the greatest shortcoming of my climate writing so far is that I'm, as an English and philosophy major, my scientific knowledge is it's not my strong suit necessarily, but I think it's informed by like kind of the cultural and scientific conceit or the bedrock or the foundation we have of climate understanding. So the stories deal with like you know, rising sea levels, changing temperatures, disease that spreads, right? Humidity, food shortages, technological problems. And I think I supplement some of the lack of scientific knowledge with like political and economic knowledge, because that stuff is really interesting to me. So one of the stories, for instance, is kind of not a critique of the Green New Deal, but it asks what a Green New Deal society would look like. Is it utopian? Are revolutions ever over? So I kind of combine a lot of different fields, I think, in the work.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Okay, so Megan Heffernan does this phenomenal assignment where she has poets writing tweets, and John Donne, I believe. And so Robert Browning, Abbie, what's his tweet for the end of the spring?
Oh man, well, he did do a lot of dramatic monologues. So, you know, he took on different characters and wrote from different perspectives and points of view that may or may not have been how he felt either. So I don't know, I think he might do some fun satire. Maybe, I don't know if anyone's seen those accounts, but I think there are a couple of different ones out there that try to mimic official accounts, and then they get taken down really quickly because they're tweeting the craziest stuff. So I could see him doing something like that about doing a lot of satire, doing something to make us think, and then maybe a Twitter thread if he wanted to do a longer rhyming something. I don't know. It's a good question though.
What are some of the funny John Donne tweets, Megan?
Yeah.
You're putting me on the spot here.
Okay, never mind, that's okay.
Yeah, I can't.
It's not even related, actually.
I've been hearing about John Donne a lot lately. I need to read him.
Oh, you definitely need to read some John Donne. Make your life better.
That's a good tweet. That's a good tweet.
There you go. I have one for Karen. And I know that we've talked about this. I was fortunate to hear your article. You're in class when we were in class last quarter. But I think that the metaphor between mangroves and family networks is such a strong one. And you may have touched on this a little bit already, but how did you kind of come to that metaphor? And what are some ways that you see like this network of mangroves interacting in the same way that families are interacting, or anything you want to speak with that?
You know, it's funny, like I said, I was planning to just write a nonfiction piece. I was going to interview him, but I was on Sanibel Island with family, and that's sort of somehow how that evolved. Interestingly, it wasn't planned, but thinking about, you know, kind of like family history and the concept, like the more I studied mangroves, the more I sort of saw like traits of families, and particularly my family. I began to see those parallels between like resilience, for example. Like I was in a class with, I'm forgetting his name. Eric, what's his name? Anyhow, sorry.
Oh, Miles Harvey, the professor? Is that
Yes, Professor Harvey.
Yeah, I was thinking of a student. So.
Sorry, I was in a class with
Don't tell
Professor
anybody.
Harvey, and he asked us one day, like, what's your superpower? And I said, resilience, because, when you come from a family of Holocaust survivors, you can go different ways. Honestly, you can live your life with trauma, or you can figure out resilience. And many of the qualities in my family are kind of like survivor qualities. And so I started to think about the mangroves, and then the more I learned about them, like the fact that they, I grew up on the Jersey Shore, and so salt water and nature was kind of always a part of my life. So I started to think about those combinations, and then kind of parallel to this crazy complicated family that I have, that is, and sort of had that concept of the roots and the, sort of, So it just kind of evolved, honestly. It wasn't what I planned, honestly. It just kind of evolved. The more I started thinking about my particular family, and the more I learned about mangroves, it just kind of started going that direction. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's great.
Yeah. No, it was really a kind of an organic process that started from doing that research, actually, and learning about mangroves. When I met with that guy, I wasn't thinking, I'm going to do a personal essay about the family. I was like, I'm going to write. But then, I don't know, I just started thinking about it, and that's where it went. So, yeah.
Well, we are all thinking about these issues, and these are three beautiful approaches to multiple crises right now. In fact, Abbie's yours is the first, pandemic poem I've read, and it's fascinating, wonderful work. I think maybe we might give a final air clap and then probably cut out to get to our next session. So thank you again very much, readers.
Thanks, Guy. Hi, Eric.
He zoomed in now. Okay.
Hi, Caitlin.
Cedar.